Hi, my name is Elise and I'm with the UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center. Thank you for joining us on this virtual field trip. Today's field trip is on Tahoe's aquatic food web, and we're going to explore the ecology, or the things that live in Lake Tahoe, and how they interact with one another. Let's dive right in. So welcome. This is our virtual field trip on Tahoe's aquatic food web and who lives in Lake Tahoe. We're going to head to a thought swap. And if you are in the room with somebody else, you can answer these questions together. Or if you're alone, you can pause the video and write down some of your answers, or even start to think about them by talking out loud. So the first discussion topic that you'll talk about or write about is to describe any organisms in Lake Tahoe that you have seen or that you think might be there. And I'll give you a minute to pause and think. All right, let's go through some of the possible answers. Maybe some of the organisms you named were fish or zooplankton, like the ones shown here. Maybe some of you listed plants that live in Lake Tahoe, such as algae or aquatic plants. Maybe some of you listed organisms that live near Lake Tahoe but don't always live in the water, such as birds of prey or bears who might fish near the lake. Any of those are awesome answers. Number 2. Describe ways organisms might interact in the Lake Tahoe ecosystem. You can pause the video and think for 1 minute. The second question, describe ways organisms might interact. So there are a lot of different species interactions that we might observe. So some of the ways that organisms might interact in Lake Tahoe, those can be beneficial to both organisms. So both of them get something good out of the interaction, and they help each other. That's called mutualism, but that's a big word you don't necessarily have to remember. One big way that animals and plants might interact is through predation, and that's when one animal eats another animal. So the predator eats its prey, and that is one interaction that's common. One example is that I know both the mysis shrimp and the Lahontan cutthroat trout eat Daphnia and Bosmina. So these two predators share these two prey. Number 3, describe ways you think humans help or harm the Lake Tahoe food web. Pause the video for 1 minute and think, discuss, or write. So some of the ways humans might help or harm the food web. So some humans might fish in Lake Tahoe, so they would remove some of the fish that they like to eat from the food web. And that could either harm the ecosystem, or it could help it if they are fishing out what's known as an invasive species. And invasive species are sometimes introduced by humans. So sometimes humans will put species that don't belong in Lake Tahoe in the lake. And sometimes those introduced species can be so successful and have no natural predators that they become invasive species. And we have several invasive species in Lake Tahoe. One of them is this mysis shrimp right here. And that is a way that humans have harmed the Lake Tahoe food web. But we'll talk a lot about invasive species and introduced species as we continue on in our field trip. And when we do this field trip live, we have a live fish feeding with our Lahontan cutthroat trout Lonnie at the Tahoe Science Center in Incline Village. And we have a video of Lonnie being fed that is included in this short video. And as you watch Lonnie, and she's being fed mysis shrimp, if you want to remember that, you can make some observations. So, as a scientist, I like to make observations, ask questions, and make connections. And these 3 prompts here will help you do just that. So, we're going to start with I notice, and you can fill in the blank with whatever you notice when you're watching Lonnie hunt down these mysis shrimp. And then we're going to ask a question that starts with I wonder. So, I wonder how Lonnie does that. And the third thing I want you to write down is it reminds me of, and that's making a connection between this new phenomenon and something that you might already know something about. So you can go ahead and watch Lonnie swim around and chase her prey. And as you do that, write down at least one sentence that starts with each prompt. I notice, I wonder, and it reminds me of.
Hi there, my name's Anne and I'm an AmeriCorps member with the UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center. And as a part of your Aquatic Food Web virtual field trip, today we're going to be doing a live fish feeding with our Lahontan cutthroat trout, Lonnie. I have one of Lonnie's favorite snacks here, which is the mysis shrimp, and we're going to make observations as I feed her. As Elise was previously mentioning, when we make observations, we can note what we notice, what we wonder, or what questions we're asking, and even what this thing we're observing maybe reminds us of. So keep those in mind as you make observations as Lonnie gets to snack down on some mysis shrimp. What observations did you make here? I noticed that Lonnie seems to be hunting down her food using her eyesight, much like I do when I go to eat. Lonnie here is actually a native fish to Lake Tahoe. And if you've been to Lake Tahoe before, you know it's known for its blue, clear waters. Those beautiful waters help fish like Lonnie hunt. Because they're clear, she can use her eyesight to actually track down her food and eat it. With that in mind, let's give Lonnie a little bit more food to see how she's using her eyes to track that food and capture each of those tasty little mysis shrimp. Our mysis shrimp here that Lonnie's getting to eat is actually an introduced species to Lake Tahoe, so a non-native species in comparison to Lonnie being a native species to Lake Tahoe. The mysis shrimp was introduced to Lake Tahoe in the 1960s on the hope that it would help all of the fish living in Tahoe increase their food sources and be able to grow big and strong and be able to be fished out of the lake and be really big fish. However, what scientists didn't know when they were introducing the mysis shrimp to Lake Tahoe is that the mysis shrimp also has really big eyes that are sensitive to light. So where Lonnie lives in the lake is not actually where the mysis shrimp spends most of its time. When the mysis shrimp migrates through Lake Tahoe every day, when the sun is out and shining, the mysis shrimp swims deep down into the bottom of Lake Tahoe where it's dark, and at night, the mysis shrimp will migrate up to 1,000 feet up in the water column so that it can feed without having its eyes hurt by the light sensitivity. So, Lonnie in Lake Tahoe actually probably isn't going to be eating very many mysis shrimp, but the mysis shrimp is definitely a tasty treat here for Lonnie. So 2 of our other fish species that we have here in the Tahoe Science Center are a largemouth bass on the right and a bluegill here on the left. These are 2 non-native species to Lake Tahoe, meaning that they were introduced to the lake. We're going to make observations again as each of these species gets to feed. We're going to start by feeding the bluegill. You can observe here that the bluegill is having a little bit of a hard time finding his food. Take note of that as we go over here to feed our largemouth bass. We'll give him one more munch. There he goes. So our two species here, our largemouth bass and our bluegill, as I said, were non-native species to Lake Tahoe. And these two fish actually came out of Lake Tahoe itself. They are found in the Tahoe Keys, which is a much shallower, warmer type of water than the deep, colder parts of Lake Tahoe. And that makes sense here if you observe that these two species had a harder time finding their food. They're commonly found in warmer, shallower waters in other lakes, and they actually don't rely on their sight as much as Lonnie does to find her food. You may have noticed when I put the mysis shrimp in for each of these fish to eat, they didn't really rely on their eyesight to track down that food to eat. They didn't really track down the food very much at all. So our two species here, the largemouth bass and bluegill, you may have also observed, are divided by our simple divider here. And that's because both of these fish are quite aggressive, and we don't want them to actually hurt one another. And for those of you that in your pre-field trip activity and on your species card had the largemouth bass, you may have even noticed that one of the species that the largemouth bass may eat is actually, in fact, the bluegill. You'll get to explore that more in your aquatic food web activity that you'll be doing later in your field trip with Elise. But I'm going to pass it back to Elise now.
You might have learned about food chains in school before, and we are going to talk about food chains in this field trip as well, and how they relate to food webs. So, this is really important. When you are going to do your activity, you need to draw the arrow in the direction that the energy flows. And this might get a little confusing, so we're going to go through an example now before we hop into our activity so we all understand and are on the same page. So we are going to start off with the sun. And the sun gives its energy to all of us here on planet Earth, but some species in particular really enjoy and use that energy. Those are many plant species, such as grasses. So here we have grasses and the sunlight. And if we want to draw our arrow in the direction that the energy flows, which direction do you think the arrow is going to go? Pointing to the right or pointing to the left? So it's going to point from the sun to the grass because that's where the energy flows. The energy flows from the sun into the grass. Next, what are some things that might eat grass? The example we have here is the deer. And we are going to explore which direction the energy flows. If the deer is eating the grass, which direction is our arrow going to point? From the grass to the deer or from the deer to the grass? It's going to point from the grass to the deer because the energy is flowing from the grass into the body of the deer when the deer eats the grass. But an easier way to remember that is the direction that the energy flows. You can also think of this arrow as a little spoon. So this grass is feeding the deer and the sun is feeding the grass. This is a really, really simple food chain. But what happens when it gets a little more complicated? A food web. So we know for a fact that there are more plants that use sunlight than just grass. And some of those examples are wildflowers and fruits and nuts. So how do you think these two additions will alter our food chain into a food web? You can think about where these wildflowers get their energy from and where the fruits and nuts get their energy from, as well as which organisms get their energy from the wildflowers and the fruits and nuts. But to start off, we're going to draw our arrows in the direction that the energy flows. So the energy flows from the sun into the wildflowers, and then when the deer eat the wildflowers, the energy flows from the wildflower into the deer. So that spoon is scooping into the deer's mouth. Same with the fruits and nuts. The energy is flowing from the sun to the fruits and nuts, and that same energy is being transferred to the deer. So that's the direction these arrows are pointing. But let's make it even more complicated. What if we introduce elk, squirrels, and humans? You can think about what those organisms like to eat out of this list and where they might get their energy from. And our arrows are going to point again from the energy source to the new organisms. So all of the arrows are going to be pointing toward the elk, squirrel, or humans. So this is getting even more complicated. We know that our elk like to eat fruit and nuts as well as grasses. So we have arrows of the energy flowing into the elk. We also know that humans can sometimes hunt deer and elk, and they have even been known to eat squirrels from time to time, as well as fruits and nuts, and even some types of wildflowers. So it gets really complicated when you start to introduce these different species. And that is how a food web is different from a food chain. So before the field trip, each of you should have been assigned one of these information cards. And if you weren't, you can go ahead and travel over to our Who Lives in Lake Tahoe slideshow and write down 5 of these information cards. And there are 23 organisms total. So if you pick 5 of them randomly throughout this stack, it should give you a quick understanding of some of the organisms that live in Lake Tahoe. So for each information card, you'll have the name of your organism up here at the left, and I have it circled in red. So the name of this organism is floating algae. But where you're going to find where your organism gets its energy from are written right here. So it gets its energy from the sunlight and from nutrients. The third question is where you're going to have to do even more digging. And you can make a hypothesis about what you think might eat your organism based on the other cards in the slide deck. And so if you look at these other cards, the mysis shrimp, aquatic macroinvertebrates, copepods, Daphnia, and Bosmina all have floating algae listed as something that they eat. So you can do some hunting through the other PowerPoint and try to find a few other organisms that eat yours. So for example, the copepods, you look at its slide, and I can zoom in so you can see that it in fact eats floating algae. So that's something that might eat your organism. And I have a slightly more complex example here with the bluegill. And this is a fish that was introduced into Lake Tahoe. And again, you can find the name of your organism in the upper left-hand corner, bluegill, and write that here. And then where does your organism get its energy from? And we phrased it this way because some of the organisms are plants and some of the organisms are animals. So animals get their energy from eating other organisms, whereas plants get their energy from photosynthesis. Your research card here has all the information you need to know, and it says that scientists have observed this species eating the following or found these in its stomach contents. So these species have been found in the stomachs of bluegill fish: Daphnia, copepods, Bosmina, land insects, and aquatic macroinvertebrates. So that is how you answer the second question. And the third question is, I think this might eat my organism. And I know based on some scientific inquiry that the largemouth bass can eat the bluegill, which is actually pretty interesting. When we head to the Tahoe Science Center, you may notice that we house our bluegill and our largemouth bass in the same fish tank with a plastic divider that keeps them from fighting. And these two get along pretty well as far as bass and bluegill do. However, we do notice that there is some aggression between these two types of introduced species. So that's an overview of the information card. So, knowing all of that, and hopefully you've had time to collect your information about your organism, we are going to head to our Jamboard. And that is where we can all work together to create a food web. You can find the link to the Tahoe Aquatic Food Web Jamboard in your PDF. And what you are going to want to do is to create a copy of this Jamboard so you can edit it. Please do not edit the original Jamboard because it makes it hard for anyone else to edit it after you. So you'll make a copy and save it to your drive. And then once you've done that, you can go ahead and edit it. So you're going to need both this Jamboard and the document Who Lives in Lake Tahoe that has the list of all 23 organisms that we have here. So you can pick your 5 favorite out of this list and start to create a food web. So I'm just going to start with the floating algae. And we discussed before, this floating algae gets its energy from sunlight and from nutrients. So back on our Jamboard, we're going to select the pen tool, and you can pick whatever color you want. I'm going to pick blue. And once you do that, you are going to want to find your organism. Here's my organism, floating algae. And where did our floating algae get its energy from? Let's check. From the sunlight and the nutrients. All right, so from the sunlight, here's the sunlight. So here's the first two. If the floating algae is getting its energy from the sunlight, which direction is our arrow going to go? To the right or to the left? It's going to go to the right. So we can draw our arrowhead here, and that is showing that the energy from the sun is flowing into the floating algae. It also got its energy from these nutrients here, but you just need that one arrow. All right, let's pick another organism. How about the bluegill that we talked about earlier? Now the bluegill gets its energy from zooplankton, such as Daphnia, copepods, and bosmina. Let's start with those. First, let's find the bluegill. Where's the bluegill? There it is. All right, it gets its energy from the bosmina. So which direction is the arrow going to go? From the bosmina to the bluegill, or from the bluegill to the bosmina? It's going to go from the bosmina to the bluegill because that is the direction that the energy flows. The bosmina is being eaten by the bluegill. What else did the bluegill eat? It ate copepods. So the energy is flowing from the copepods into the bluegill. And it also got its energy from this Daphnia. It ate the Daphnia. So the energy from the Daphnia is going to flow all the way over here to the bluegill. And what else did it eat? The bluegill ate land insects and aquatic macroinvertebrates. All right, where are the land insects? Oh, right here. Okay, which direction is this arrowhead going to point? Up or down? Down, that's right, because the energy is flowing from the land insect to the bluegill. Same with the aquatic macroinvertebrates. And those are all of the organisms that give their energy to the bluegill. And you can take some time now using these examples to go ahead and complete as many organisms as you can. If you want to go through and include each and every one of these organisms in your food web, more power to you. If you want to pair up with a buddy from the class, you can share this Jamboard with someone else in your class, and you can do half the organisms and your friend can do half the organisms. Or if you're doing this as a whole class, your teacher will have already assigned an organism to each of you. You have made it to the halfway point of this field trip, and all I want you to do now is to take a little break. And we have a guided mindfulness practice that is posted to our YouTube where you can rest your eyes and get recentered to continue on with our field trip. Now that you've taken a little break, let's continue our discussion. And once you have completed all of those arrows, it will look something like this. And that is pretty complex. So let's break it down. Let's talk about it with a few discussion questions. And again, just like before, you can write down your answers in a notebook or share them out loud with somebody in the room. The first discussion question is, what do you notice about the food web? Pause here and look at the food web to think. I notice that some of the organisms are animals and some of the organisms are plants. I notice that some of the organisms that live in our food web actually live on land, not in the water. I wonder what the difference between these colors might indicate. I also notice that the color of the arrows are different. Some arrows are blue and some arrows are red. I wonder what that might indicate. I notice that the bluegill has a lot of arrows pointing toward it and only one arrow pointing away. Which organisms have a lot of connections with other organisms? We can figure that out by seeing which organisms have a lot of arrows pointing toward them or away. So this rainbow trout has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 arrows pointing toward it, and 1, 2 arrows pointing away. So this rainbow trout eats 5 organisms and is eaten by only 2. We can start to think about what that might mean. So this rainbow trout has a lot of connections. Which other organisms have a lot of connections? These aquatic macroinvertebrates have a lot of connections. They have 1, 2, 3 organisms that they eat, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 organisms that eat it. Some other organisms that have a lot of connections are the largemouth bass, the bluegill, the lake trout, the minnows. I'm noticing that a lot of these fish on purple cards have a lot of arrows pointing toward them. So they are consuming a lot of other organisms. And I'm also noticing that some of our smaller organisms, such as the floating algae, the bosmina, and the daphnia, have a lot of arrows pointing away from them. So they have a lot of connections, but they are being eaten by a lot of organisms. Do you notice any organisms that compete for the same food? So, which organisms eat the same food? Let's find an organism that is often a prey organism. So the daphnia. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 organisms that get their energy from it. So 6 organisms eat the daphnia, whereas the daphnia only eats 1, the floating algae. So what does that tell us about competition? And we see, if we follow this line all the way back, that the kokanee salmon also competes for the same prey, the daphnia. We can also notice that the Lahontan cutthroat trout preys upon the Daphnia from this arrow right here. So the cutthroat trout is also in competition. So far, we have 1, 2, 3 organisms that are competing. We can also follow this arrow all the way up here to the mysis shrimp, also competing for the Daphnia, as well as the lake trout. And the last organism on this list that eats the Daphnia are the minnows. So a lot of those organisms are all competing for the same prey. So the questions I have here are, do you notice that the cards are different colors? What might that signify? You can pause the video and look at our completed food web. So I did notice that some of the cards were different colors. We have these purple cards, we have blue cards, and we have yellow cards. We also have this special light blue card. And I hope you came up with some good hypotheses about what these colors might indicate. You may have noticed that a lot of the cards that were purple were fish. Maybe you noticed that the cards that were yellow are neither animals nor plants. Maybe you noticed that the blue cards included mammals, plants, birds, and insects. Maybe you thought about how earlier in the field trip I told you that this mysis shrimp was an invasive species that was introduced into Lake Tahoe. So I'll go ahead and tell you now, the purple color is a non-native species to Lake Tahoe, where the blue color represents a species that is native to Lake Tahoe. So the Lahontan cutthroat trout is a native species to Lake Tahoe, whereas the kokanee salmon is a non-native species to Lake Tahoe. All of the cards that are purple indicate that that species is not native to Lake Tahoe. It came to Lake Tahoe at some later point in its natural history. Second question is, do you think non-native species have become successful in Lake Tahoe? And you can use the food web to find evidence to support your claim. So pause the video and look at the food web and come back and discuss. And moving on to the second question, based on the directions that the arrows are pointing, many of these purple cards have lots of arrows pointing towards them. What does that mean? That means that these organisms are eating a lot of the species that live in Lake Tahoe. So, based on this information, I would say that the non-native species in Lake Tahoe have become successful, because if their success is determined by how much prey they can hunt, that means that these organisms are very good predators. They are consuming a lot of the species that live in Lake Tahoe. And what do you think that might mean for the food web? Well, if this is our native food web that has all of the blue cards, all of our native species, what do you notice? You can pause the video here and think about what you notice about this food web. I noticed that there are far fewer organisms, and that a lot of the organisms, such as the aquatic macroinvertebrates, have a balance of how many organisms they are consuming. So the aquatic macroinvertebrates are getting their energy from 3 different species, as well as giving their energy to 3 different species. So this species is in balance. I also noticed that certain organisms are predators, like this mountain whitefish, all of the arrows are pointing toward the mountain whitefish, right? So that means that this mountain whitefish is a top predator in this system. Whereas the floating algae, most of the arrows are pointing away. It's giving most of its energy away. So the floating algae is a big prey source in Lake Tahoe. You may also notice that some of the terrestrial organisms, such as bears, humans, raccoons, and osprey, are not connected to this food web. And that doesn't mean that they don't interact with it at all or that they are not native to this area. In fact, humans have been in the Lake Tahoe Basin for thousands of years. The Washoe tribe has lived here for a very, very long time and has interacted with the aquatic ecosystem in many ways. However, you may notice in the coming slides how the relationships between the terrestrial ecosystem and the aquatic ecosystem changes with the introduction of new species. Which I may add, most of these new species were introduced after the onset of settler colonialism, when non-Indigenous people moved into the Lake Tahoe Basin and started to make changes to the ecosystem. So what I want you to do is go ahead and find an organism and count how many arrows are pointing toward it and how many arrows are pointing away from it. Pick an organism and count the number of arrows pointing toward and away. Write the numbers down. Pause here. And I'm going to use the Daphnia as an example. So I see that 1, 2, 3 arrows are pointing away from it, and only 1 arrow is pointing toward it. So that means that the Daphnia is being eaten by 3 organisms, whereas it is only eating 1 other organism. So pick out an organism on this sheet and count. You can even write down how many arrows are pointing towards it. And what does that mean? That it's eating those organisms. And how many arrows are pointing away from it? And what does that mean? That means it is being eaten by the other organism. And I want you to go ahead and make a hypothesis about what is going to happen to the numbers you wrote down, when we introduce our purple card non-native species, like the mysis shrimp, the largemouth bass, and the bluegill. Go ahead and pause the video and make a hypothesis about the organism you picked on the last slide. Make a hypothesis. How will the number of arrows change with the introduction of non-native species? Pause here. So for my organism, the Daphnia, that had those 3 arrows pointing away and 1 pointing toward, the Daphnia is giving its energy to 3 different organisms and receiving energy from 1. I hypothesize that more organisms will eat the Daphnia after we introduce these species. It will become prey and give its energy to more organisms than it receives its energy from. I don't think that the Daphnia could eat any of these purple organisms because they're all pretty big, and I know the Daphnia is tiny, tiny, tiny. So that is my hypothesis, my prediction. Now count the number of arrows pointing toward and away. Have they changed? What might this mean? Pause here. All right, let's check it out. So for my hypothesis, what do I observe? Well, I notice that it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 arrows pointing away from it and still only 1 arrow pointing toward it. So the Daphnia is now being eaten by 6 different organisms in Lake Tahoe, and it's still only able to use 1 organism as its prey. Is your species in the same sort of balance? Is it still a top predator or prey? Has its role changed in the ecosystem? Pause here. So what does that mean about its population? Will the population of the Daphnia go up or down after we introduce these new species? It'll go down, right? Because it is being eaten by 3 new organisms, and those are represented by these red arrows. 3 new organisms are eating the Daphnia. So my Daphnia now has many more predators to contend with. But what about if you picked the bear as the first organism? So before it didn't have any connections to the food web whatsoever. But now it has a tasty kokanee salmon in the mix. So our bear has become a predator in our ecosystem because it only has 1 arrow pointing towards it. Before it had 0 arrows total, and now it has 1 organism that it is eating. What about the mountain whitefish? That was our top predator before, right? It had 1, 2, 3, 4 blue arrows pointing towards it. So it was eating 4 organisms and nothing in the ecosystem ate it. What about now? Now it has 1, 2 arrows, 2 red arrows pointing away from it. So 2 non-native species are now eating the mountain whitefish. Although it gained 1 prey source, the crayfish, you can see 1 new arrow is pointing towards it. 2 arrows are pointing away. So what do you think that might mean about the population of the mountain whitefish? Now that it has 2 new predators and only 1 new prey, is it still a top predator? No. And will its population go up or down? It might go down. But we talked about many of these purple cards of these non-native species have a lot of arrows pointing towards them. These are the new predators in our new ecosystem. So is the population of the rainbow trout going to go up or down? Up, because it has 5 arrows pointing towards it and only 2 pointing away. So this rainbow trout is eating 5 of the organisms native to Lake Tahoe. It's only being eaten by 2, one of which is humans. So there have been a lot of changes to Lake Tahoe's ecosystem. And we have gone through a lot of them. We observed, asked questions, and made connections about our live fish feeding with Lonnie. We built together a Lake Tahoe food web based on evidence about what eats what. We interpreted that model food web to better understand the ecosystem. We made predictions using the food web to better understand issues with native and non-native species. So we noticed that some populations might go up and some might go down when we introduced non-native species. And what we're going to do now is to discuss some of those solutions. So now I want you to watch this video of our boat captain, Brant.
I'm Brant Allen. I'm a research biologist at UC Davis working at Lake Tahoe. I'm going to tell you a story about mysis shrimp. They are a small freshwater shrimp that ended up in Lake Tahoe because we put them there. They had some dramatic changes that they made. Mysis shrimp were put into Lake Tahoe intentionally in the 1960s, and they were put in as a food resource for the game fish that live in the lake, mostly lake trout, but also kokanee salmon. Lonnie, our pet Lahontan cutthroat trout, she was raised here at the Tahoe Environmental Research Center from an egg, and I am getting ready to feed her. So you notice how she's trying to catch her food? She uses her eyes to find the prey and then swims up and eats it. So you saw how Lonnie loved to feed on these mysis shrimp that I put in the tank. And she keyed in on them with her eyes so she could find them and eat them. But out in the main lake, that doesn't happen because the mysis shrimp are very sensitive to light. So during the daylight, right at sunrise, they swim down really deep in the lake. And they're not available to the fish that need their eyes to find their food. So what you're looking at now is a mysis shrimp. And you can notice it has really big eyes. And as I said, they're really sensitive to light with these eyes. So they swim down deep in the lake to avoid the light. What they also do by doing that is avoid predation by Tahoe fish. So if we go down deep in the lake now and look at them on the bottom, you can see them. This was filmed with a submersible, and you see all of the shrimp sitting on the bottom, hiding out from the light. So when the mysis came into the lake, it didn't work out so well as fish food, but the mysis did a really good job of feeding on our native zooplankton. So they wiped out, they completely eliminated the Daphnia from Lake Tahoe. And Daphnia used to swim around and just clean up the lake by putting little particles and algae cells into their mouth and digesting them. The Daphnia disappearing from the lake had a big impact on the ecology of the lake, but also the clarity. The Daphnia are really good at eating these fine particles and algae that are in the lake, and that's what clouds our water. So we can't see down as far as this really fine particles and algae. With the Daphnia gone, there was nobody to consume those, so our lake clarity was diminished as a result. We were fortunate enough to see an accidental experiment happening right in Emerald Bay in Lake Tahoe. We went in to look for mysid shrimp, and they had disappeared. We still don't know why they disappeared, but their numbers were so low that it allowed the Daphnia to come back and populate Emerald Bay. And as a result, we had these Daphnia back in there feeding on small algae cells and feeding on fine particles, and the lake, the Emerald Bay portion of the lake, doubled in clarity. The clarity improved twofold. So for the past 2 years, researchers have been going into Emerald Bay and using a big net pulled behind the boat, trying to remove the mysid shrimp. We wanted to see if we could recreate that natural experiment that we saw years before. So by reducing the mysid shrimp, we're looking to see if we can have Daphnia come back and repopulate the bay and create that clearing effect once again. To do that, we're going out at night. And we go out at night with this big research boat, the big trawl behind it, and we pull it through the water and catch mysid shrimp. So our big question is, can you actually remove enough mysis from the bay to allow Daphnia to come back and naturally clean it out? The second question is, if you harvest all of these shrimp, what are you going to do with them? Well, there's some really brilliant ideas about what to do with shrimp that come out of Lake Tahoe. They're very high in nutrient value in omega-3 fatty acids. That's the good part of the salmon that you eat when you eat the salmon that comes out of the ocean. So they would make an excellent product for either pets or humans, and a really nice food resource where we could then use the shrimp that we used in this restoration project to another purpose. Perhaps this lake clearing effort can actually fund itself. I hope you enjoyed your virtual tour of the Tahoe Science Center, and keep an eye out for more to come.
Thank you so much for joining us on today's virtual field trip on Tahoe's aquatic ecology. I hope you learned something about the organisms that live in Lake Tahoe and how they interact with one another. And we have one more thing to ask of you before you go about your day, and that is to complete a quick survey to see how we are doing. One thing we need every student to do before you click away from this video is to complete our student survey. And that can be found in your PDF under Evaluate. So that student survey is just a simple anonymous survey to see how we are doing. It's not a test of what you know, it's a test of how well we are teaching. And it is completely anonymous, which means that we don't ask for your name, so you can keep your identity safe and secret. And we want you to be as honest as possible about what you knew before you did this virtual field trip and what you know now. So there are 4 questions on the survey, and each question has 2 parts. So the first part is, how much did you know before you came on the field trip? And the second part is how much you know now after you've come on the field trip. And you can answer each question on a scale from 1 to 4. So, for example, how much did you know before you came on the field trip about the greenhouse effect? So you can answer from 1 to 4. 1 is nothing, 2 is a little, 3 is some, and 4 is a lot. So answer based on your best guess. And then you can answer how much you know now after the field trip. Nothing, a little, some, or a lot. So go through and answer that for each of the 4 questions that we've written on our survey and hit submit. And please do that before you even step away from your computer, so that way we can be sure that your information is counted and we can do better at our virtual field trips in the future. We also have several videos and activities that you can engage in after this field trip if you want to take it a step further. And those are all listed on the PDF version of this document.